and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And Alejandro is on his way to, I want to say Wyoming? Is it? To Devil's Tower. And he's going to go to a conference out there and talk about Steven Spiegel. And it should be a good time. Mark D'Antonio's on his way out there and a number of other people. So he is not going to be joining us today. Unfortunately, we couldn't get him on the phone, so he's not going to be with us. He will be back next week as usual. And tonight's guest, Chris Lambright. Chris wrote a book, X Descending. I read that book back in 2012, and I loved it. It's kind of like a two-part book. The first part talks, or I may have it backwards, but the first part, I believe, talks about the Paul Benowitz case. And the second part talks about Ray Stanford and the work that he's done over the years. And we're going to be touching a little bit on that. And Chris was on about a year ago, and it's always great having him on. And I'm a little under the weather, so he's going to be talking most of the talk tonight, I hope. Anyway, welcome to the show, Chris.
Hi, Martin. How are you?
Great. And it's funny, one of the things this show has brought is good friends like you. You and I actually talk quite a bit, and along with Ray Stanford, that's one of the great benefits of doing this show.
It is. I hope we can meet at some conference one of these days.
Yeah, now we're just meeting digitally. So, hey, Chris, you've been at it for such a long time, years and years, and you've done a lot of great work. But I don't know if we've ever talked about this. What was your childhood like? Did you have any experiences or anything that I know? I do remember something about you lived overseas with your parents. They were missionaries or something?
Yes, my father was a surgeon with the Southern Baptist Mission Field, and we went over there when I was 3 until about 10. Actually, it was the communists kind of started uprising a little bit. If anybody's ever seen the old Mel Gibson movie, The Year of Living Dangerously, it took place in Indonesia in 1965, and there was a little bit of a turmoil with the communists who were trying to stir up trouble, and at some point my parents got together and there was a little incident and we had 5 hours to leave. So we left everything and flew back to the States. But to go into my childhood early on, I've never had an actual experience of my own that I would tell anyone was a UFO experience. I didn't find out until years later that my parents, when they were in Indonesia, actually had an experience with, I guess there were like 30 people that had all gone to meet at the the mayor's house. There was no electricity on the end. We were on the eastern end of the island, kind of down towards Bali, in a little town called Kediri. And at the time, the only planes you saw flying were flying to Jakarta, which was on the west end, and there was really no electricity after dark. So for anybody to do anything, in this case, they were at a party at the mayor's office with some of the other missionaries and townspeople, sitting outside watching a screen. I guess the mayor had electricity, and they were watching some movie sitting out on the lawn. And my mother had described it to me, and my father verified, he remembered it, that if anybody's familiar with coconut trees, they were sitting out on the lawn, and suddenly they looked up, and about twice the height of a coconut tree, which just imagine a telephone pole, this large glowing object just moved in slowly and hovered momentarily over the group below. And I remember my mother saying they all thought, wow, that's a UFO, and must be coming to see what they were watching. And then it slowly moved off. And of course, the significance of it was that there was no air travel or of planes of any sort low on that end. There was no lights or anything else. But afterwards, they went home and nobody talked about it. And that stunned me more than anything, because I would have thought, wouldn't you be in the car just jabbering about the possibilities? And I always thought it was really strange that they took it so. I mean, even when she described it to me, it was just this large round disc or light. Either the whole thing was lit up, but nobody ran like in the movies. I was never quite sure what to think about that. But
well,
but anyway,
I've heard many times where people have said that they haven't discussed it. Well, they'll see it and they won't even talk about it. And a number of people have said right on this show that they experienced a UFO with other people and they never talked about it at all. I remember Peter Robbins had that experience, and I know there's been a number of people. A friend of mine, actually, in the antique world, had an amazing sighting with his friends, and they never talked about it even after that. They were all scared. I wonder what that is.
I don't know. It's crazy, because originally when I was in Indonesia and all the way up through high school, I wanted to go into astronomy. And for one reason or another, explanations for it, I never ended up doing that. So I ended up getting a degree in psychology, which I did nothing really with after I got into computers years later. But it was not long before I started working on the book that the whole idea of people's beliefs and what they prefer to believe, and how things that seem to fly in the face of what they believe things should be, like Feynman used to say, a paradox is just the conflict between reality and what you think it should be. And I think in some cases, perhaps it's kind of overwhelms your ability to really fully comprehend and fit it in. So it's better to just, it flies on by. I hate citing quotes, but there was a famous one. I think it was Churchill, who said, something to the effect, men sometimes stumble across the truth, but usually they quickly jump up and brush themselves off and hurry on their way. So it's perhaps easier to just not think about it and not say anything about it, and it kind of goes away. But I don't know the idea of that. One
of the cases, I just thought of this, and that's when I had listened to Chuck Fultz and I'm trying to think of the other one from the Allagash incident. When I interviewed them, they both, Jack and Chuck, they both said that no one talked about this, an amazing experience they had when they went back to the campfire. They all just felt very tired and went to bed, and they never talked about it. And it was like 10 years later for them, before the flashbacks and everything.
I don't know. I mean, the closest analogy that I had ever come up with in talking to my friends was something to the effect: if you're in a neighborhood and you're looking out for your kids, and suddenly someone suggests that there's somebody who's released from some child molester who's been released living next door to you. Most parents don't want. I mean, maybe they don't want their kids going out there, but the initial reaction is no, because you don't want to believe it. It will require that you change. And it will require you change what you do, and it will suddenly. And I think it's people deny things, and sometimes I think that's a good thing, but I don't know. Anyway, But anyway, so I got into somewhere while I was in high school. I recall in Kansas City, somehow I got my parents to just drive me to there must have been a conference or a convention, a UFO something going on, because I remember I recognized Hynek when he went by. I don't remember the year, but it had to be way back in the 60s, 70s, sometime or other. And that's maybe something in the 7th grade, which I think I wrote about in the book, was the earliest that I recall having even had a passing interest in the subject. And then I think it wasn't really, I'm sure I read all the books, but it wasn't until after college, and especially the last year in college, I had a great professor of psychology who was open to talk about everything. And somewhere after that, I think I met Tom Bland, and not too long after that, I think I finally got in touch with Ray. But anyway, it was, I don't recall exactly how, it just kind of crept up on me, and here we are. So
now, how long ago did you write the book X Descending?
2012, 2013, probably 4 or 5 years now.
And had you thought quite a while before you wrote that book of what you were going to do?
No, I had no interest in writing a book. I had zero. In fact, my interest, and that's part of the reason I've just moved to Austin. You get the blank background because I haven't even had a chance to unload everything in this house. But my interest moving here was more in screenwriting and film work and whatnot. And of course, fortunately, with the digital revolution, you can now pretty well do it all yourself. If you have a decent camera, you can go out and film lots of different things, and whether they're on YouTube or some of the network shows, the guy's running around holding his own camera. But but it was, deference to Ray. It was when I decided, okay, I thought I'll take my first shot at screenwriting, and I was going to write something about it with an idea of how would you put this into a film and whatever else. And at some point along the way, I just decided, you know what, this is what I want. I'll write this as a book. It was out of frustration. It was not that I have any interest in writing books, but then I realized at that point, because so much of my interest at the time had gone back to Paul Benowitz and the things that he filmed, and subsequently, the more I found out about aspects of Ray's film and who had seen it and that sort of thing, that's where they both suddenly began to tie in with the Air Force Research Lab. Air Force Weapons Lab in Benowitz's time, and now Air Force Research Lab. And so to me, the coincidence of that was almost mind-boggling, to think two totally separate films eventually would kind of seemingly lead me to connections that went right back to the Air Force Research Lab, Air Force Weapons Lab. So that's where that's the reason you have the Benowitz film and Ray's film in the book. It wasn't just a book about two random films. It was because they both tied into the Air Force Research Lab, and the coincidence of that, I think, was a little bit too much. In short, Benowitz, of course, when he contacted the Air Force, Jerry Miller, some of the other figures that were involved there. One of the guys that in Greg Bishop's book claimed to have snuck into Paul's house, who was running the Starfire optical range. A lot of these things, of course, were right there on the grounds of Kirtland, and the Air Force Weapons Lab and the Research Lab was involved in a whole lot of that directed energy research. And then subsequently, with Ray's film, when it turned out, finding out who had come to see his film and the subsequent development that came from that, and following every so often, doing searching to see what he's up to, and realizing, okay, so now he's gone down there and he's on a grant from the Air Force Propulsion Directorate of the Air Force Research Lab to work on his Lightcraft project. And I thought, how did he just happen to know? Subsequently, if you look in the book, you'll realize a lot of the people in the aerospace industry, and especially the new developments and, of course, work on directed energy, these sorts of things, these people attend the same conferences and get to know each other. And Franklin Meade, who was with the Propulsion Directorate, who I think, in my words, overseeing the grant that Mirabeau got, I read one time that he was like the head of the Exotic Sciences Division. And which, of course, explains, I guess, why he would attend some of these conferences on the International Society on Beamed Energy Propulsion, or the old NASA's advanced futuristic concepts, that sort of thing, where you'd have people presenting papers on different topics. So it's not so surprising that that perhaps he and Mirabeau would get together. Of course, I think it's interesting that since he retired, the last I heard, he and Mirabeau basically jointly formed a company to work on the Lightcraft aspect of it. But needless to say, it was just the coincidence of, in one case, Benowitz kind of got it stuck to him for, I guess, talking a little bit too much. But he was right there looking over the grounds where essentially the Air Force Weapons Lab had their, the Space Vehicles Directorate now. That's what I believe it's called. And then Mirabeau ends up falling in with Franklin Meade from the Air Force Research Lab Propulsion Directorate. But he gets a grant. If you may recall, in one of the documents about Paul, when he went down to the base, I think it was that November of 1980, and kind of gave his presentation, that one of the men from somewhere, I don't recall, right there at Kirtland, had talked to him about perhaps getting a grant to study it and helping him fill out the paperwork. But it never happened. So I don't know why or who exactly that was, or what the rationale was for it. But hey, I guess if you're a team player, you get a grant. Well, but anyway, that's how the book ended up talking about those two films, because they were definitely films, definitely showed things. There was good support for the films being what they are. And oddly enough, both guys end up having run-ins or connections to the Air Force Research Lab, which I thought was interesting. So anyway.
Yeah. Now, I want to touch on a bunch of different things. Later on, also Ray's film, and what you're talking about, the beam ahead situation, the beam ahead light and all that. But I want to talk about Richard Doty right off the bat, because I don't know if you happen to see Dr. Stevens Greer's latest film on Netflix. Did you happen to watch that?
No, I haven't yet.
Okay. Well, I sort of critiqued it, I guess, not too nicely. But anyway, one of the things that I was absolutely shocked by, and I think you might be too, but maybe not, is Richard Doty is in the film quite a bit. And he's actually talking about aliens as if he's seen them himself. It's really bizarre. And he's in it, maybe 10 times. And with spots, and he never once says anything negative, like against UFOs or against the possibility of UFOs. As a matter of fact, he confirms them. And it's really bizarre. I actually want to, as much of grief as he has caused, I'd actually like to have him on my show sometime to, I don't want to say interrogate him, but just trying to find out what he's about. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, like I said, I've spoken to him once or twice over, the 20 years since the middle 1980s. It's never been a jovial, friendly conversation, perhaps because of me, because I tend to have found points that don't add up. And the minute you ask, it goes south quickly. So I'm not, and I guess in a way, I'd make 2 points about it. One, I can't think of any other Air Force, specifically in this case, anyone who had ties or connections in any way with, I don't know if you would directly call it an intelligence agency, but an investigative agency. I mean, none of the other people that were mentioned in the Benowitz case say a word anymore. You don't hear from them at all. Ernest Edwards, who was the first person Benowitz talked to and who had gone to Benowitz's house and had seen the films, I don't know if he was earlier than Doty, but of course he's supposedly handed or passed off Paul to Richard Doty. Edwards, I would think at that point, would be somebody well worth talking to, because one of the documents that I found, which narrowed down for me specifically when Paul got those films, was that Edwards' first contact with Paul was a document in which he stated he was talking to two guys from Sandia, that he had first heard from Paul in January of 1980. Much further ahead, or much further back, earlier than any of the documents the Kirtland documents, they say, which imply but never state. So people have had the misunderstanding that thinking Paul experiences began in the middle of 1980, when no, they hadn't. But you'll notice there are no documents for that first 5 or 6 months. My point simply being that even when Edwards had gone on tours of duty and come back and had gotten back in touch with Paul, then he'd contacted his superior and saying, I'm back in touch with Paul, I'll fill you in. Mm-hmm. Edwards isn't talking. I mean, he's not out there taking interview requests, and I would imagine he would have a substantial amount of information he could add to it. But for some reason, Doty seemed to have become the go-to guy. Okay. And I don't know whether it's because the minute he knocked on Paul's door, his face was known, so there's no point in him trying to be anonymous anymore, or whether, you put a candle out there and you know that all the moths are going to be attracted to it, and if nothing else, now Doty starts taking names and he knows exactly who's coming. I mean, that's my speculation, but it's the only reason I can imagine why he would at least be willing to go on camera and keep talking. Of course, what bothers me the most is I have a suspicion it's like joining the FBI. If you get hired by the FBI, you're not an idiot. Mm-hmm. And if you get hired to work with AFOSI, you're not an idiot. And there were aspects of things that I found, and I think everything that I knew, I believe, up to that point is in the book, that convinced me Doty was, he was the point man right there. But whatever he's saying about his past experiences, I don't think I would. I mean, how are you going to prove it? How are you going to know not to know? The best thing to do to me is just let it ride, because he's obviously was involved in defusing Paul Benowitz, and he's come out and said any number of other things. And then, as I wrote in the book and the addendum about he and John Lear being at Lima Site 21A and over in Laos, which should have been before he was in the military, but I found his email address on an old history, when the History Channel had a forum in which he stated he was over there, and when the base Lima Site 85 was attacked, he was at Lima Site 20A. And I began to think, wait, that's the same base that John Lear claims he was flying in and out of. But as soon as I confronted him with it, done. It was, so I couldn't place them both there at the same time. But that whole thing, if I convinced myself to trust my instincts, that smoke had some serious fire behind it. Which, keep in mind, what are the odds? Two guys claim to be at the same place 10 or so years before ever getting involved. Both end up right there talking to Paul Benowitz, a UFO case, but playing both sides of the coin, the good cop, bad cop side involved. That's mighty coincidental. And the only tie-in that came in both other than I could see was actually CIA. Now, Doty did say his brother was in the CIA in the southern part of Laos, something to that effect. His brother, his cousin, or somebody. So I don't know how that works. But me personally, if he's out there talking now about aliens and everything else, I suspect I don't know if they're paying him for it, maybe not. I don't know if he's just doing that because, in a way, keeps his face out there, but now he's talking a lot of bunk, perhaps. And so if you don't know what to think of him before, you certainly won't know now, which is really just more smokescreen. Yeah. But I think the record shows that he was there. If Paul called Edwards in January and wanted to talk to him about those films, and Edwards put him in touch with Doty, there's not a chance in hell Doty waited until the middle of the year to ever go up and talk to Paul. He would have hoofed it over there or over to Thunder Scientific right away. He would have known early on what was going on. If it was something serious, just like in the document I mentioned, when Edwards got through talking to the Sandia guys, he immediately wrote up this stuff and talks to his boss and tells him what's going on and fills him in on. Doty would have done the same thing, and there should be some documents. But yeah, I think that's past history. Yeah,
Chris. One of the things I've failed to do here, and I really should be more aware of this, and that is, there are a lot of people that listen to the show perhaps for the first time, or it's perhaps the first time they've ever heard of the Paul Benowitz case, and instead of just acting like we kind of know how things go, why don't you, in a nutshell, as briefly as you can, tell the listener who's never heard about the Paul Benowitz case, what happened.
Sure. Okay. And for what it's worth, everybody who knows or sees anything about MJ-12 or hears anything about Dulce and some things that still are in the media, so to speak, right now, all of these originated with the Paul Benowitz case. He was a gentleman who lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and this is all in the late 70s and 80s. He actually owned a company called Thunder Scientific that, forgive me if I make a few mistakes on it here, but they built humidity testing, I think, equipment, and had contracts, if I'm not mistaken, with lots of military groups, Air Force, Navy, whoever else. And he was pretty well off. I mean, I think he worked with his sons there. And in fact, one of the gates, the main gate, I guess it might be, from Kirtland, if you stand at the main gate and look across the street, catty corner, that's where Thunder Scientific is located. So he was right there. But he also lived in what I guess I would call the ritzy part of Albuquerque, an area called the Four Hills, which is kind of a little bit east-northeast. You can find it on the map. And effectively right across the fence from Kirtland Air Force Base area, and had a straight line shot about 2 or 3 miles away, I mean, maybe even a mile or less on the northern end of it. Anyway, had a straight view of the three hills that formed the Manzano weapon storage area, which was a double perimeter electrified fenced off area inside Kirtland Air Force Base, because there were supposedly nuclear weapons or nuclear materials that were stored inside that base, inside the three mountains, the Manzano Mountains area. Paul had taken an interest in the cattle mutilation goings on that were happening in the late 70s, and there was a meeting, I think, that took place. I don't recall the exact date of it, but he had been to this meeting, and I think he's even listed on there as even a representative of APRO. So to my understanding, perhaps he had some association, I don't know how directly it was, with APRO at the time. But while there, that's where he first heard and met, I think, Gabe Valdez. And Gabe Valdez, of course, was the patrolman who was in charge of a lot of the area around the Hickory Indian Reservation, which is where Dulce and the Archuleta Mesa essentially are right up in that area. And Paul asked him to take him on a ride. At the time, you were hearing about all the lights that were being seen and the cattle mutilation things going on. And Gabe was a very well-known figure and a respected figure at the time in that area. So in July, I believe it was, of 1979, Paul went out there one day and drove from Albuquerque up to that area and rode around with Gabe. They saw some pretty bizarre things, which really sparked his interest. And it was when he was leaving that he actually snapped a little Polaroid snapshot picture of the kind of the mountains, showing, I think, the Dulce or the Archuleta Mesa area in the background. And later on, his wife looked at that and saw some unusual something up by one of the trees. And I've seen that photo and I've looked at it, and you can't tell what it is, but it certainly seems to have some kind of geometric shape to whatever it was. That really set Paul off. So he spent over the next 2 or 3 months in 79 driving up to Dulce area, one time with his son. A lot of this is in the book, but the point was he was really interested, but his focus was on Dulce. He was not paying any attention that I know of around Albuquerque at all. He was driving up to Dulce. The last time he went up there, he described some very unusual things, but when he got back to Albuquerque, his wife made a comment about something she thought she'd heard over buzzing noise over the house, and the dog was barking, and that seems to be what, because of his previous interest in the subject anyway, sparked his interest. And he began, keep in mind, this is my calculation, around the middle of December of 1979, very cold in Albuquerque, but his house, his condo, whatever it's called, you can kind of go out and climb up on 2 levels and get up on the roof, and now you're really up there and have a clean shot, almost 360 degrees of the whole Albuquerque area. You can see the airport, you can see straight over to the Manzanos and whatnot. And on one of the nights when he was out there, I believe the description was he first saw some odd things glowing on the ground. Now, this would have been about 2 miles, almost due south from where he was, but basically right at the base of these 3 mountains that are inside this double perimeter electrified fence. So whatever this was seemed to be going on inside the area of the Manzano weapons storage area. And he watched, and eventually, all of a sudden, the objects jumped up, took off, flew south, went around the end of the mountain, which, of course, blew him away. And so over the next few nights, he'd sit out there and watch. And usually when he got out there, these things were already down, apparently near the ground. And at one point, I described, he had sent me some almost legal-sized pages of handwritten notes of the time when he had seen these things. And he had his wife out there with him. So it wasn't just Paul by himself. By that time, he apparently had a Hasselblad camera that he had bought, and he had a telescope with a camera mounted on it. He had a 250 millimeter lens on. I mean, he had several different types of cameras and film equipment up there, and was able to even tell his wife when he'd see some bright flash below one of the objects, and a few seconds later, boom, they'd light up so brightly that he said you'd almost expect the explosion to come rolling across the plains, but you heard no sound at all. But it must have taken place over 3 or 4 nights that he was, and one time I think he even got out there early enough to see the objects, may have been one or all of them, coming around the soft side of the mountain. And the way he described it was, they came around that mountain, dropped straight down, in 5 seconds, lights out. So whatever they were apparently, my conjecture at this point, but low enough to not be caught on the Albuquerque airport radar, because as long as they stayed below the altitude of those 3 mountain peaks, I presume they would be ignored. And if anybody saw them from a distance 2 miles away and just caught them one time, you might think helicopters, who would know. But he got all this on film, and the 8mm films are some of the images that I reproduced in in the book. But it wasn't until years later when Photoshop and you had image enhancement techniques that I remember being really surprised when I asked him one time about him, and he said, oh, the original films were much clearer. You could see the colors much more brightly. What he had sent originally, I think, were he'd run the 8mm film through a little film display with a little monitor on it where you're like a splicing machine, an editing machine, and was taking images off of that. So I had to try to do a little bit of work to enhance them, presuming the background would be dark, allowed you to kind of pick out colors from the surrounding background. So you're hopefully left with what's only produced by the objects themselves. But there's enough detail in there to tell you there's some, whatever they were, strange things flying out of there. Were they alien? I don't know. Were they Air Force? I don't know. I mean, I talked to some other people who'd been in the military before, and one guy had been in some intelligence work, and he said, well, usually you look at the response. If somebody comes to you and tells you there's a potential threat, you ask questions, and you go out to see what the threat is. You don't turn around and try to drill the guy who's telling you unless you know what's going on and he wasn't supposed to see it. And that seems to be all things in my opinion at this point seem to indicate that whatever was out. Oh, and the other point too was made to me by one guy was this is inside the double perimeter fence where there are supposedly nuclear materials. Ernest Edwards, the first person that Paul talked to, was at the time a major. He was later on a lieutenant colonel, I think, or a colonel. But at the time, he was in charge of the guards who were inside and patrolled inside the fence. Those were apparently Air Force guards. They weren't Sendia security guards who patrolled outside the fence. And the point would be that if something was going on, what I was told by an acquaintance of mine was, you tell the guards what's going on so they don't shoot somebody. Because if they don't know what's happening, somebody's going to pop off a shot accidentally. You best tell them whatever you need to tell them to be sure they don't open up and shoot the wrong person. That's kind of logical to me. And so my presumption would be, unless there was some way when the things are coming in or when they're leaving, unless you call a meeting, get all the guards inside for a few minutes, like maybe they do out at Area 51 when you're not supposed to see something outside. But unless something like that happened, the fact that it was that point that there was no alarms went off. I mean, that was one of the things Paul described. It was him realizing no guards are coming, nothing's happening. There's no alarms out there. So maybe whoever's out there, maybe they don't even know these things are coming and going. That's part of the reason that he finally picked up the phone and called Ernest Edwards, because he wanted to talk to him about the intrusions that he'd been seeing out there. And of course, that got all the rest of this is history. But subsequently, after he called and talked to Richard Doty and Ernest Edwards, and they knew Paul was still in touch with APRO at the time, and I believe, I'm fairly certain, was sending them kind of updates on what was going on. But somewhere along the way, he either began to not quite trust Doty, FOSI, the Air Force, because I don't think he liked what their response and what was happening. It was not what he expected. And he began to contact other people, maybe Los Alamos, and calling some people in Washington. And that may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, because it was around the middle of 1980 when you suddenly begin to hear, you see Doty's name popping up in documents, letters to APRO, other things happening. People begin to hear about it, and some of the information actually was leaked out of APRO, who had hoped to sit on it, or I guess if it wasn't something they could actually verify for themselves, they didn't normally release it. But somebody apparently released some of that information. The Wetzel letter, if anybody looks at the book, you'll understand what that is. And that's actually, to my knowledge, that's the first place Doty's name, even though it was spelled D-O-D-Y, that's the first place Doty's name appeared. And of course, Bill Moore later on said Richard Doty wrote it to APRO as bait. So you begin to see some real machinations going on of trying to either draw people to Doty, maybe so he can tell them whatever he wants to tell them, or in some way the Air Force begins to put out information that either makes Benowitz look a little bit more unhinged, or whatever the rationale was at that point. I guess you need to be in there to be able to manage it. That seemed to be what was going on. It was later on the whole story of the computer, which Greg Bishop claims that Bill Moore, I believe I had this right, that Bill Moore said that the Air Force had gotten Hynek to deliver the computer to Paul Benowitz, which then later Paul supposedly communicating with aliens and all those things that would definitely make Paul sound like he'd gone off the deep end. And I got into it at the same time. When I don't even remember why I first called Paul, but by that time in the mid 1980s and after 83 and 84, everything anyone heard about Paul was all of this dulcet aliens beaming him with, that kind of thing. I don't know whether the whole idea of the tinfoil caps originated with Paul, but there's a lot of things that Paul had written about with Myrna Hansen and some other things when what's his name, Spiegel or whoever was down there that sound like it. But that's why when I first called Paul, I had no idea of the early films he got. He was telling me all of this strange things about aliens and whatnot, and I'm thinking to myself, did somebody call the Air Force with this information? They would have said, thanks, call MUFON, and hung up on him. So I finally asked him, I said, well, what was it that made you first contact the Air Force or call the base? He goes, oh, it was the films back in, and I'm like, what? What films are you talking about? And then all this prior story comes out, all of this stuff that had been going on long before any of this, and you begin to realize, holy cow. When I first saw that, he sent me a box of 8x10s and more of the images, and actually had that little Polaroid stuck in there, so I had to be careful sending it back. But when I saw that box, I knew, these were not just little lights, whatever he got. And boy, wouldn't I love to have seen the still shots with a 250 millimeter lens. And because to me, this is the combination of still shots, blow ups of the, those things, close ups, the film that goes along with what you're seeing. If we could get our hands on that material now. Years later, after he had kind of cut everyone off, I even wrote a letter to his wife and said, if you still have those pictures, please lock them away.
Yeah,
at some point somebody will do.
Sorry to interrupt you, Chris, but while we're touching on this right now, do you think these things still exist? Do you think they're in file cabinets somewhere?
The films?
The films, pictures, stills, all?
There's a part of me. Well, there was a time when I talked to Paul when he was having the films developed, and he, of course, had made the point that when he had taken the films down to have them developed at a place in town, he sometimes suspected that he didn't get back the whole film. Pieces of it were gone. But I don't know, depending on how long he waited, I know he didn't get the films developed right after he took them because he still had some footage from back in his, going up to Dulce and whatnot. So nobody should have been getting those films unless he had already called the Air Force. So I don't believe, and he couldn't have called the Air Force if he hadn't already had the films to examine himself. So some of the earlier films, I think, would have been intact, at least as far as being a complete film. But whether he locked them up in a safe or whether his wife had them, I would have hoped he kept them. You hear talk about, some old films that he might have, 8mm films that he had kept at Thunder Scientific. The paranoid side of me would say, if I was the Air Force, I would have made those films disappear one way or the other. In Greg Bishop's book, when he talks about when Miller and Doty went up to see Paul, implying that at some point Doty had either a small camera on him or was potentially filming the house or whatnot. And then, of course, later on you hear the stories of the guys from Kirtland going into his house and looking at his gear. A lot of this was in Bishop's book. Which I highly recommend, actually. I mean, he starts later than I start in my book, with the films. But Greg Bishop put some really interesting information out there. But the idea that people might go into Paul's house to look at his equipment certainly opens up the can of worms possibility that they were going in looking for just more than just that. So I don't know. I tried to talk to his sons one time, and I can understand, if you've got contracts, there's money to be considered, that if they have no interest in what Paul was doing, then why should they worry? They don't really talk to anybody, I guess, as far as I know. But I can just pray that those films would be somewhere. It's like I've told Ray, damn it, get a digitizer. Digitize the films. Then you can play them forward and backwards. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to touch the original. But if you get it on digital format, then you can do a whole lot with it. But I would hope Paul's stuff is still available, but is it? I have no idea.
Now, Bill,
as far as I know, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. Did Bill Moore have any contact with Benowitz? There is a reason I'm bringing up Bill Moore.
Oh yeah. It's my gut feeling, and this is just mine. I can't prove this to anybody. But when I was working, yes, Bill supposedly, and he's come out and admitted all of this as well, that he was in essence recruited by Richard Doty or someone above Richard Doty, who then put him in touch with Richard Doty to befriend Benowitz and kind of report back on whatever Benowitz was either doing or who he was talking to. There's a lot of documentation about that Bill has written himself, and of course in his famous speech in Las Vegas where he kind of revealed all of this, he admitted to it, that he'd kind of been working with AFOSI or Doty, so to speak, to help spy, I guess would be the word, on Paul and what Paul was doing. Bill's story was he was approached by someone when he was in Albuquerque. He was, I think, on his book tour at the time, and he was approached by someone in Albuquerque. He had had some odd calls prior to that, but in Albuquerque, he had gotten another call, and somebody approached him, and later and arranged to talk to him and said they'd meet up again and wanted to recruit Bill for whatever reason. You're the only man we know who takes this seriously, or something to this effect. So it seems very innocent that here's Bill. He's been on these talk shows, and he seems innocent, and now they're coming to recruit him. And plausible for all those years, the decades, I thought, okay, well, that's whatever. And Bill's story was, if he says no, he gets nothing. If he says okay, then at least he has his foot in the door. And that's a deal with the devil that many of us probably would have decided, okay, I'll do what I can, I'll take it, because at least you have a chance to find out something. So it's that part of it's obviously plausible, I suppose you could say. I mean, I never faulted Bill for doing it. If you're a writer and you're into investigating, you take that chance. Me now, when I was working on the book and I was trying to get the chronology correct, the dates, when did this person first do this and do that and the other? And then it got to the point that some odd timing things began to show up that to me had Bill getting involved with APRO and becoming kind of like their head of special investigations, perfectly positioned so that when the Wetzel letter that he later says Doty wrote as bait would get to APRO and be handed right to Bill. I'm like, that could have been a coincidence. It's got Doty's name in it. His job was supposedly to be the head of the special investigations. Simplest thing to do would be what I guess I did, and I'm sure many others did years ago, right? You just pick up Kirtland and you ask, is there a Mr. Doty? And just see if the thing pans out. But Bill, now keep in mind, that would have put Bill in possession of a letter with Doty's name in it, explaining some damned interesting goings on at near Kirtland and some training area stuff that Wetzel was involved in. And I spoke with Wetzel. I called his house, and his mom said, "Oh, he's back." Yeah, I woke him up, and he kind of backed up some of what was in the letter that was sent, but not all of it. But needless to say, when Bill receives this letter, that would have been a perfect ploy for Bill to go and happen to meet Doty, because Doty's name is in it. But Bill claims he never investigated it. Wow. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're sitting at APRO. They just, within a month or a few months earlier, put you in charge of special investigations. They know who Paul Benowitz is, and he's been telling them about strange goings on around Albuquerque. You get this letter, you hand it to your new Bill, and it's got all this information in it, and it mentions this guy Doty who supposedly knows about this, and you never check it out. But then within a month or 2 months afterwards, by coincidence, you get recruited and you sit in a restaurant in Albuquerque, and the guy who's going to be your contact, Richard Doty, is the exact same guy whose name is mentioned in the letter that was sent to APRO and handed to you. And now all of a sudden, that's the guy that you meet right there. The part that bothered me was, if Bill had begun to check it out and had then become recruited, if he had gotten the letter and followed up and met Doty through the letter, then it becomes obvious evidence of military, Air Force, AFOSI, recruiting somebody inside a UFO organization to spy on a ufologist or on Paul Benowitz in this case. I don't know that that would play very well if that was the story. That wait, so you've got actual military intelligence, whoever people writing letters and recruiting secretly inside, spy versus spy kind of stuff almost. And maybe that wasn't going to look too great. And so it was easier to just then have Bill innocently going on his book tour and claim he was getting these calls from people. And suddenly he's now in Albuquerque and meets the guy. And that's how he was recruited. I don't buy it. I don't. I think my gut feelings after all of that, and I'd have to go back and read all the details again, is Bill was a known asset of some sort all along. I mean, everybody always says it's curious when somebody speaks Russian. You always wonder, where'd they learn that? Oh. Not many people learn it. You think, okay, are they in the intelligence? I mean, I've had that case talking to a bartender who was speaking Russian to somebody, and I said, so what branch of the military intelligence were you in? Boing. He's like, oh, he was in such and such, because not many people speak it. Bill did. So I don't really I don't know. It just strikes me. Here's another telling point, in my opinion. Bill claims the first person he met wasn't Richard Doty. When he was in Albuquerque and arranged to get a meeting, some guy walked up to his car, I think wearing a red flower or handkerchief or something, and that's how Bill knew who he was. And that's the first guy who, technically speaking, or I guess you'd say recruited him, if I'm not mistaken. There's other records that I found, and I mentioned it in the book, where Bill supposedly was claiming the first meeting, I think, took place at a McDonald's in Phoenix. You're like, wait, what? And then now it's supposedly taking place at this place in Albuquerque. But needless to say, after he then gets in touch with Richard Doty, and when Bill comes out in Las Vegas and says, spills the beans, so to speak, and owns up and says he was recruited to spy on Benowitz, blah, 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 he never, ever revealed who that original person was who recruited him, and then later introduced him to Richard Doty. I would assume that would be a more major figure, or at least somebody of note, because you'd be able to connect the dots and maybe the threads and decide who's running the show here. I always thought it was strange if Bill's going to come out and fall on, the mercy of everybody to say that, yeah, he was trying to do the right thing, blah, blah, blah. Why wouldn't you come out and just say everything? And if you were a writer going to write, wouldn't this be the perfect book? Now you've been on the inside, you have all these connections. Bill could have written a book and retired on that one, but he never wrote another book on it. Yeah, he wrote the books beforehand. To my understanding, I don't know that he's ever written, especially on the UFO subject, but never wrote another book. Most investigative journalists that get involved in something, they write a book quick. They get a book deal. You come out, you name all the names, done. Bill would have been the hero of the day. Yeah, but he's never said much of anything except mentioning that he was recruited by Doty and some other things he said before that. After the fact, basically disappeared by most accounts. I guess he's been on a few things over the years, but he never wrote a book on this case, and I don't understand why. If you're a writer, this is like the gold mine. So something tells me there was more. Bill was not just an innocent party, in my opinion, out there, based on everything that I found when I began to look at it, because it took me a lot longer to dig up things that were said by other people and things that Bill told other people and things that people had said that Bill had said, and I began to think it just doesn't add up. So, but that's history too. So,
well, Bill, actually, Greg Bishop and Bill Moore are still, close friends and still in touch with each other. But you were actually at the 1989 MUFON when he actually talked about being engaged in disinformation. Can you? Tell
I'll
us
give you
what it was
the
like.
Short shrift. I was actually standing. Bill had not been seen all day. Nobody, you can imagine. We knew he was going to be the last speaker, and that usually is a sign of something. But nobody had really seen him. And I was standing outside the door waiting to go in and sit down, and was standing with Linda Howe at the time. And she was a little perturbed at Bill because the story was, I didn't know this for a fact, but the story was that Bill had made some comment to someone else, that Linda and another guy, I don't recall his name, were basically useful idiots in this whole scenario. Because Linda was one of the early people involved with Doty and whatnot as well.
Right. Yeah.
Linda Howe didn't like that, and not that I blame her. But so we're standing out front waiting to go in, and here comes Bill. And Linda basically confronted him in a way. It was nothing bad. I mean, I don't blame her. And Bill stood his ground. She stood her ground. I was kind of standing there. And at that time, I'd been around a little longer and seen a few things. And there were aspects of Bill that you had to admire. I mean, the guy seemed to really know a lot of people and have been a lot of places. And I didn't know him personally really well. I mean, I knew him by face, and I just said, yeah, there's to some extent I agree with him that I think his point at the time was that the real work of ufology really doesn't belong in the hands of the beanie wearing types that are out there or something. But anyway, so then we went inside, and I was sitting next to Linda Howe at the time when Bill was giving a speech, and I think Stan Friedman was sitting at the very front because he had been one of the guys who had, I believe, worked closely with Bill early on. And then Bill gives his whole speech, and I remembered by that time I knew, and when Bill finally said something to the effect of, it all began 10 years ago with a man named Paul Benowitz, and I felt vindicated. I mean, that sounds odd to say, but I remember thinking, I was right about that much, at least, that Paul was the impetus for all of this other bullcrap that came out afterwards. MJ-12, the Dulce, I think, stories were just, a red herring to get people off of Albuquerque and looking somewhere else. But we sat there and watched the whole thing. Bill went through the entire story. I'm sure transcripts are out on the internet. And when he finished, boom, he bolted out I don't mean to make it sound that bad, but probably for good reason, he went out the door right behind him. Mm-hmm. Didn't walk out into the audience and talk to anyone. I do remember, to his credit, or whatever you want to call it, I do remember when Bill left and everybody began to stand up and walk out, seeing Stan Friedman still sitting in his chair just staring forward, because I don't think he had a clue. I honestly don't think. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Stan. I don't think he had a clue, but I remember just seeing the picture of the guy sitting there and feeling, I don't know, I really felt for him on that case, but he can probably explain that even more if he hadn't already done it. But yeah, Bill was there, and people began to shout when he began to admit to having known what was going on and basically falling in with AFOSI to, working with Doty. And of course, everybody assumes, and it's rightfully so, that Bill's going to present it in a way that at least, makes him look, I guess, relatively speaking, as good as he could. Had everything, all the loose ends sewn up, so to speak. But I think most people knew at that point Bill was, and maybe that was the whole goal too. Bill was pretty well through as far as people opening up to him on the ufological side of things.
Right. I don't think he did any more talks after that one.
I don't think so. But if he would write a book on all of this, I only talked to him a few times, and I think we exchanged a letter or two here or there. So obviously, like in many cases, you're left with questions that you can't have answered, and I just have to kind of deduce what some of those answers may be. But it would be, if you could get Greg Bishop and Bill Moore on, that would be a real show to watch. Yeah. But anyway, and Doty talked to Greg Bishop, if I'm not mistaken, when Greg Bishop was working on his book, in part because Greg was tight with Bill. And my impression has been that if Doty thinks you won't call him out on things, or Doty thinks you're going to basically go along with him because here he is, he's going to sit and talk to you and drive around and help you out, then he'll talk. But if you're going to quiz him on facts or catch him on certain things, then he won't talk to you. That's why I think you'll find him, at least what I've seen so far, he's only in those shows where he's kind of given free rein. Nobody really grills him on how he got into this or what went on or whatever else. He's just allowed to talk because, he's a character that you put his name on it, like in the show Mirage Men, which rather, that was a disappointment in my book. But what I thought was interesting is if you go look at the beginning of the show when they have the little old 1950s flying saucers flitting around, and you see that it's called a perception management production. And I thought, I guess there's admitting something right up front. but that, so I don't know. As far as Doty's concerned, I guess he has his own things to live down when the time comes, and as we all do. But I haven't talked to him in ages. I doubt I'll ever talk to him again. Last few times we talked, they didn't end well, but I didn't expect them to, so whatever.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're just about at the top of the hour, so just a couple of announcements. First of all, Connie Willis runs a show called Blue Rock Radio, and she runs a great show. She talks to people on ufology, and she was actually going to do the show. I was having a little bit of laryngitis. I'm okay now, but she was going to, I asked her to do the show, but she just was too busy tonight. I also wanted to say that we are taking calls in the second part of the show, and that number is 603-967-4030. Just a couple of other things. I'm going to be at the Shag Harbor UFO Conference coming up at just in a couple of weeks. That's the 50th anniversary, and there's going to be some, witnesses actually that were there. I'm going to be talking with also Jordan Bonaparte, and I'm going to do a live show from there. So that's going to be on Saturday, on the September 30th from 6 to 7. Now, that'll be up on YouTube, and also it'll be a podcast for members only. So that'll be coming out a few days after that. So you can look for it if you want to watch it live from Shag Harbor. That is September 30th at 6 to 7 p.m. It'll be right on YouTube. So now that we're kind of going into the second hour, I wanted to ask you, how did things such as MJ12, you mentioned, there was someone in the chat room right away who said, how did that possibly come out of the Paul Benowitz case? So can you talk about that? And then also Dulcie, too.
All right. There was the Dulcie situation started because, as I said, Paul had taken an interest in the cattle mutilation aspect of things and had gone to an early FBI meeting or whatever. That's pretty well known in early parts of 1979 and met Gabe Valdez and had gone to drive around on a night ride with Gabe, which, of course, Dulcie is right at my geography is correct. Dulcie is kind of right at the base, so to speak, of the Archuleta Mesa, and a lot of that is inside the area that's called the Hickory Indian Reservation, which one of the things Gabe Valdez did was patrol inside that area. And this was back in the day when all the cattle mutilation things were going on, and a lot of people know a lot more about that than I do. But it was Paul having ridden around that area with Gabe Valdez and then taking that Polaroid and seeing the little image in it, and then going back later on to I think he may have even camped out or stayed overnight a few times here or there. But Dulcie itself may be kind of a misnomer for what was going on, because most of what I think Paul was talking about were things that he either thought might be happening on the mesa, the Archuleta Mesa, or around it. Dulcie, the little town itself, may have just been the point that everybody thinks of when you're driving to Dulcie, because that seemed to be a place that had come up, and eventually it came up in all sorts of other, what I consider now the myth of ufology, as far as the idea that there were alien bases underground and whatnot. There may have been some things underground up there. I mean, I've had my own reasons to think that the Air Force itself, or whoever else, may have actually been doing some testing in the area. But to my knowledge, nobody's ever actually seen an underground base. I mean, Paul had talked about some things. People have wandered all over that, back in the day, looking for places Paul talked about. So, but that's the whole thing about Dulcie. It was just Paul had begun to get interested in that. And then later on, after all the stuff that he was doing down in Albuquerque began to take hold, he was talking to the Air Force about Dulcie, and they put him on helicopters even. Even Edwards had talked about this and flew him back up there and flew him around Dulcie.
Wow.
And I'm sure all of that is just to get his attention back up there where maybe they could control the situation a little better. And if he thought there was something on the ground, they'd say, oh, really? And maybe there were stories supposedly of things being planted to look suspicious down there. And so there were some things going on around there. But to my knowledge, what happened in Albuquerque, the Paul's films in Albuquerque, and things going on in the area of the Indian Reservation and Dulcie, all of those things, I see as two separate aspects, two separate areas that Paul was interested in. And the Dulce one just became the easier red herring, diversion, get him thinking, do whatever they can, fly him with helicopters up there. Don't focus on Albuquerque. But what was the second question that you wanted to ask?
MJ-12.
There was a document that came out, and I don't recall exactly where it came from to begin with, but it's the document that it starts with what sounds like some analysis of Benowitz's films, like films showing this item or the other, films showing some other item or other. And then below, it comes across, it begins with a statement, something to the effect of UFOs still being investigated by, and this is where, if I'm not mistaken, Bill Moore had changed some part of this document to say NASA, and I believe originally it said NSA, but it also mentions that it's cases that affect national security or something like this are handled or basically investigated by MJ-12. And if I'm not mistaken, you have to be very interesting. You have to be very curious, because the spelling of it matters. In this particular case, it's written out, if I'm not mistaken, MJ and the word 12. I go into all of this in the book because later on you'll find people coming up with acronyms like Majestic 12 or writing MJ number 12. But I believe project names, code name, whatever you might want to call it, are typically you're going to write it the way it's supposed to be. But it also mentions further contact, further information. And it's where you first see the names Miller/Fugit. So whoever was writing this was dropping in some names of people that probably would have preferred not to have their names in there. Miller, presumably Jerry Miller. Fugit was the guy who was in charge of the Starfire optical range. He's the guy, scientist in charge of mirrors, laser imaging, whatnot. He's the person who, in Greg Bishop's book, if I'm not mistaken, had supposedly been ushered into Paul's house one night real late when Paul was gone. Some people broke in and they took a look at Paul's equipment that he was kind of using to detect the signals for the aliens and whatnot. But Robert Fugit, I looked into him as a very interesting character. Jerry Miller has since retired. But the point to answer the question was, that's the first place anyone ever heard of MJ-12. Most people think of MJ-12 as coming out in the slide film or whatever that were somehow secretly sent to Jamie Chandray, who was friends with Bill Moore at the time. And they had a little dog and pony show, a little presentation, claiming that there was these copies of these documents or whatnot that were MJ-12 documents and whatnot. People seem to forget that was about, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 2 or 3 years after the first, Paul began to contact the Air Force and all of this stuff really began to churn, when this one document comes out and has MJ-12 written in it. But nobody seems to remember that document. It's as though, if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to recall, but if I'm not mistaken, this may have been the document that Richard Doty, it was a telex, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to go back and double check, but supposedly Bill may have not given it to Paul, or there was some document that Doty gave to Bill, and Bill kind of thought maybe he was supposed to slip it to Paul and get Paul all churned up, and maybe he didn't do it. But the point was, here's a document that has this MJ-12 as some highly secretive group with some control or interest in the subject that comes out in relation to Paul Benowitz, because it mentions the films that Paul had been doing. And it's right in the midst of Bill Moore and Richard Doty and all of this stuff, but it goes nowhere. And then 2 or 3 years later, suddenly Bill's in with Jamie Chandray, the producer out of hell, and they've got these pictures that were supposedly sent to Chandray of these documents, and they're MJ-12 documents. And I'm like, somebody had planned on that storyline, so to speak, getting out, and potentially had hoped that maybe they'd get it to Paul, perhaps, and then Paul would run with it and start spreading the whole thing. And when it didn't happen, somebody found another way to get it out there. But once again, Bill Moore seemed to be center stage in both storylines. But that's why I don't buy MJ-12 at all. First off, you would need to put the legitimate project name. If you were Doty, if you were someone else, why would you put any kind of legitimate, highly secretive name of any group in a document you're going to give to Paul Bennewitz. You could have made up anything. So there may be some group out there. It wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, in fact, it would make some kind of sense. But I don't think it's MJ12 at all. And I think all the other acronyms, Majestic 12 and everything people have, Majority 12, whatever you've heard over the years, are just offshoots of this, something that came out in a document that was supposed to go to Bennewitz or was intended to diffuse him and make him run with it and spread it around or something to that effect. So I don't buy it. I mean, anymore, at least at that point. I spent a lot of time on Aquarius. That went nowhere either. So anyway, but that's what I mean when I say there are still aspects of things that people talk about today, storylines that circulate out there that people just don't realize. They originated with the case of this man in Albuquerque who had gotten these films. The response was not, let's see what films you got. The response was, let's squash this guy's credibility as fast as we can and throw so much alien stuff out there that people won't know where to go with it. But anyway, as I said, unless those films are still somewhere, unless somebody hands them over or unless Bill writes a book or somebody comes out and admits, that there was something to it and gives the names of everybody up the ladder so you can follow the names to whoever was in charge. At this point, it's kind of one of those cold cases that, I don't know if we'll ever have a resolution to it, but I would like to see some justice done for Paul Bennewitz, who thought he was doing the right thing and got it.
Yeah. Someone wrote in the chat room that they were under the understanding that Bill Moore was talking about MJ12 5 years before he received anything in the mail. Have you ever heard that?
No.
Never did?
I never have. I mean, if, believe me, if that's the case and I just never heard of it, fine. I'd rather have the truth out and get the correct information instead of repeating it. But I looked carefully at this. I was interested in UFOs all through that time, and actually I was a lot more directly active in things at that time. And I believe I'm correct that if you go back and look, you'll see. I'm not saying somebody could come out with some document today that seems to be post-dated, for some date way back then. But to my understanding, I've seen nothing. I mean, why would Bill and Jamie Chandray have a presentation showing these documents they received that had MJ12 stuff on them if Bill had known about it 5 years before? I don't know.
Okay.
To my understanding, I had never seen any word of it, and I would love to see any evidence if somebody's got some that it had been mentioned prior to that.
And so there was absolutely no mention, as far as you know, from anyone before that, right?
Not that I had ever heard of. My knowledge, and I looked back, and I tried to do as far back as I could, digging as far back as I could, and I found no evidence prior to that one document that supposedly was to be slipped to Bennewitz that there was ever any reference anywhere to MJ12.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about Ray's films and things like that, Ray Stanford. But before that, we have some questions that came in on the forum from Carrie. And one is, do you think there is any form of web surveillance carried out by government agencies on the subject of UFOs that could trigger alerts in order to target and investigate individuals using certain criteria?
Well, do I think there is? I would suspect there would be, because I would do it. I mean, the point being, you have to first start from the question of, if this subject matter, or at least any provable truth of it, is out there, you're far better able to manage it if you see it coming, if you know it ahead of time. And as I said, I wouldn't be surprised, but I suspect that one of the reasons Doty's name was finally put out there was partly to draw everybody to him, because obviously the first thing I did was pick up the phone and call him. Now he knows who's interested. So you would keep a running tab of who's interested in the subject, and you have to kind of follow who they are. But if this subject is as important as it is, that there's this kind of effort to suppress the information that's really telling. I mean, who cares if somebody sees something in the distance and they can't prove anything? Let people talk, it's like Bigfoot. But if you've got good hard evidence of something that especially, and I think that was the significance in the Bennewitz's case, it wasn't just that he filmed something somewhere. he filmed it over an Air Force base. There would be questions asked. If the congressman or anybody saw the films and believed what they were seeing was real, somebody would be called to account. That makes it a serious issue. But if that's the case, if all of this is as secretive as it is, with the digital technology, especially supercomputers, depending on who you put in charge of it, whether it's the NSA or someone else, I would keep tabs on keywords, combinations, names, this sort of thing, at least to see who's doing what. Seems to me somebody somewhere is going to call it a national security issue, and they'll get some budget and justification for doing it. But I don't think you could leave it to the low-level hiree to do it. You'd end up with someone like Snowden or whoever who would find at some point along the line blow the whistle on it. Whoever's in charge of this, in fact, this may be where you have some group like an MJ-12 who has got some serious autonomy and can set up this kind of surveillance or whatnot with people that are not going, true believers in the military sense, I guess you'd say, who are never going to talk. I don't know if there's a way to segregate information so nobody can put two and two together and know what we're talking about here, UFOs or whatever. Why are we tracing all these guys when all that they ever talk about is UFO evidence? But you may remember in one of the documents, the UFO hypothesis and I believe in survival questions, where the guy that was writing in an NSA document was making the observation that a lot of the reasons that things back in the days of the Holocaust and whatnot, that nobody seemed to catch on was because people just couldn't believe something so terrible could happen. That the people who were monitoring the conversations themselves just couldn't believe that they were happening. But the point he was also making is you need to have ways to track the stuff because you need to make sure you're catching it ahead of time. You can't leave all this stuff up to just the whim of whoever's doing it. So I wouldn't be surprised. I would also think you wouldn't necessarily even have to go too far to do the surveillance on it. If you set up an organization like MUFON, where you just have people report to you, then you don't really have to do surveillance. You just run the connection, you run their database, you watch what comes in or out, and you hit delete on certain things, and that would pretty effectively allow, and especially if you had a few people positioned in the right place that could inject into the conversation and basically turn it this way or that way. It would certainly keep things out of, it's the same reason I think Blue Book went away, because it takes the hot potato out of the Air Force's lap, puts it in the lap of some public organization, but your same guys might be running the organization. So I think there would be a good ways to monitor the situation where you don't necessarily have to, like I said, an autonomous group. Well, there you go. You just set up a UFO organization, you make sure it becomes worldwide, or at least has more power than any of the other groups, and then you get everybody to feed your information to them, and you just have your administrator monitor the stuff that comes through long before you ever hit it, make it publicly viewable. They'll delete what they want. If you've looked at some of the YouTube videos you can find, there was some discussion about that kind of thing, where people who were responsible for monitoring the MUFON database would find certain cases just disappeared. Some don't know why. Is it given to the STAR team? Is it given to whomever else? But that's what they said. So I'm just citing, that some of the people had made the comment that some cases would come in and they'd come back the next day and puff, gone from the database. So wow. I'll leave it to them to answer for that. Yeah. But anyway, I wouldn't be surprised. You would think if this is that important, somebody would be watching it. How they're doing it, I don't really know.
Yeah. If they actually, there's still question whether, maybe it's like a disinformation type of thing, but there's still question whether the Air Force or government agencies even care about it. That's the way they're, putting it out there, whether that's true or not.
As a kind of a corollary, you may remember the story that a few years back, WikiLeaks began to see certain entries being changed or modified in certain ways, and they began to, in some way, trace back the IP addresses, and they realized that a lot of these IP addresses were going back to Virginia, kind of towards Langley. And they began to suspect maybe there are people who are monitoring the information that's being put on WikiLeaks. And if you can't necessarily just erase it, maybe you go in and you just change a few keywords, or you change a little bit of something, or you drop out this name or whatnot. And effectively, you may end up just cutting off the threads that tie things together so that it goes nowhere. But if somebody's monitoring WikiLeaks, why wouldn't you monitor something that, if correct, potentially is far more significant or maybe far more secretive? So I'm not saying it's possible. I mean, I'm saying it's maybe possible to monitor an entry in the MUFON database and just change the name of the city or change the date. So nobody can look and say, wait, we've got these correlating cases that all seem to occur at the same time in these cities, and look, they're all on a line. That would potentially spark somebody's interest if you could go in and just modify it a little bit. So, there's a mistype in this, or it wouldn't be hard, I think, to kind of at least mitigate the problem. So who knows? It's just still speculation at this point until we have an Edward Snowden who comes out and reveals that to everyone.
Yeah, there's also another question in the forum is kind of along the same lines of whistleblowers. This person, Kerry, wanted to know what you thought about supposed whistleblowers such as Bob Lazar or Dan Burrish. Are you familiar with Dan?
Yeah, but let me just say first, Lazar. There were aspects of Lazar that rang true to me. I can't get into the specific details of it. I just have to say somewhere in my gut instincts, and I've heard and read all the stories of people tracing back his school history and claiming, whatnot. Is it impossible to use fake news to diffuse a situation? Well, here we are, 2017. Fake news seems to be everywhere. The Russians are buying stuff on Facebook or whatever, ads on Facebook to hope to change a few minds here and there. Would it be possible for someone to go in and modify some of Lazar's information, as I think it was the Woodses or some of these other people who have claimed they could find no evidence to back up his school history or whatnot? But then again, you got the newspaper pictures of him out there, and I think it was Los Alamos or wherever, working on his jet car and those kinds of things. And so I would just say, I don't write Bob Lazar off. I mean, Paul Benowitz talked about some fairly out there things. Who knows why he got to that point? But the crux of his story is solid as a rock. I don't know what Lazar saw. Was he set up? Is this some way to weed out potential whistleblowers by showing them strange things and see who squeals? But then at the same time, you have the curious story that John Lear was somehow involved with Lazar early on. And John Lear may have actually gone out there with him to see some of the things Lazar was talking about. So those are other witnesses, if you want to call them witnesses, and from my understanding, it wasn't just John Lear. But it's coincidental that he suddenly shows up. But there were apparently other people that Lazar had talked to who were going out to these places with him on whatever night at a certain time to see things that he was telling him, and that much seems to hold true. So I might have thought, well, that does seem to suggest that he was working out in these places where he would gain some knowledge the average person would never get, enough to tell people what times to be out there. All I'm saying is, that's why I just say there are aspects of Lazar that I don't dismiss. Not only because when he talks and you look at his face, the way he presents himself, seems fairly believable to me. But that doesn't necessarily make it true, just because I, am kind of on the fence with it.
Well, I'm
Dan Burrish and all the others, far less so. The guy that claimed he had worked at, even at Dulce, and what's that guy's name? He's passed away, I believe. But all those stories, I don't buy them.
Yeah. As far as Lazar goes, I'm kind of on the fence about him. And one of the things that makes me really think twice is George Knapp's thought. I have a lot of respect for George Knapp, and he thinks he's a real deal, and George is a very smart guy. So
I have to say, I was very appreciative of, when Knapp had me on, Coast to Coast a long time ago, because I agree with you 100%. George Knapp does not seem to be and even at the time, being a newsman where he was, these guys have reputations to lose if they're suckered. So if Knapp I agree. If Knapp stood by Lazar at the time, I have to figure he has a lot more information to base his opinion on than I did. And Knapp has never seemed to me to be a lightweight as far as investigation and whatnot goes. So that's a good point.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about Ray. Now, I know Ray's listening, and I'm hoping he calls in. But I want to talk about, because you and I have both gone to Ray's house, and I've seen some unbelievable things. Now, the one thing that you hear, and I get a lot of comments about this in chat and comments on the YouTube video and on the podcast, is maybe Ray can explain it. Why doesn't Ray show the world his amazing things?
Yeah, the quintessential question I've asked for 20 years. I support, let's just say to begin with, especially the film that Ray has, that I wrote about. And Ray had sent me plenty of images, over the past 20 or 30 years when I first met him. And since then, we talk for a long time, and we go hot and cold like brothers, we arguments, and then we won't talk for a while, and then it finally works it out. I know a lot about Ray's background. I know my impression of his personality. I don't have any issue with if somebody's wrong about something or right about something. It's not a matter of being, the point is, it doesn't bother me if on occasion he shows me something and I'm like, Ray, I don't think there's wow factor in this or that or the other. But every time he sent me things, he knew that if he sent me an image of something to look at and he wanted to know what I thought, he knew I was, in my way, going to put it through the ringer. If I didn't see what he saw, I'd tell him. If I could see what he saw, then I would tell him that. And sometimes I would say, yeah, but, right? What do you do with it? I can see it. It's like some scientist examining something in a faraway galaxy. They can see it, and another scientist may see it, and it means something. But for the average person, make note of it. But what do we do with it? But there were plenty of things that Ray has filmed that, in some cases, I found things that he had not seen. In one case, purely by accident. But to me, one of the most significant things I'd ever seen, still raises the hair on my arm. So I know, and in fact, just by sheer coincidence, when I first went to visit Ray years ago, he was actually living in Austin at the time. But when I went to visit him here years ago, it was because I was working on kind of a painting of the Socorro case, and I happened to see Ray's book, and I knew who Ray was, and I bumped into him at a conference, and he invited me down. A year or two later, I came down to Austin to see him. And this was prior to the computer age. Everything was on film, or that was all you had. And he showed me plenty of things that he had that subsequently, years later, I get a chance to put them in Photoshop or whatever and take a closer look at them. But I remember seeing them. So I knew he'd had them all that time, and he took them on film. But this film that we're talking about specifically, the more recent, the Beam Ahead film, I remember him saying to me, because I think I was seeing him 6 months, 7, 8 months maybe after he'd taken the film. And he said, here, let me show you something I just got not too long ago. And he put it up on a slide screen in his living room and shown it on the screen. I described this situation even in the book, that I remember seeing this, when you're seeing something real. I mean, your intuitive feeling of, I'm looking at something that was definitely filmed against the sky. It's way up there. And I got up and walked to the screen and stood, less than a foot from the screen to try to just get a good look at what this thing was. And I remembered at the time, no doubt in my mind that this was a frame from an actual film that he had taken. And of course, then later you see all the other frames as well. But it's not until, of course, years later when you get into the computers and now you've got Photoshop and other type of enhancement programs that you're able to actually work with them on the pixel level and get in there and try to pull out more details here and there. And Ray spends plenty of time doing that. I mean, I guarantee you, all the fame he's gaining in the dinosaur tracks and paleontology, I'll guarantee you the time he spent on that is nowhere close to the time he spent looking closely at these images and finding details in them and whatnot. And but even then, even in this case of this particular film, it's not just the film, it's the aftermath. I mean, it's Ray got the film. I looked at it. I could see the beam, but I'd be speculating. I mean, I knew enough to guess the beam's doing something, or why would it be there? But it's the aftermath later on, the whole story that came when Mirabeau went to visit Ray, and all of that afterwards that convinces me even more so that this particular film may be the film of, well, I say the film of all films, and then I immediately think of some of the other ones Ray has gotten that I can't even explain unless it is what it is. I mean, that's the only way to look at it. It's what it is. Now, does this make it aliens? Well, to me, that's a catch-22 because who cares at this point? I mean, I laugh because I think it's like an Indian sitting on the coast of South America and seeing a Spanish galleon going out there, a half quarter mile or a mile off the coast, and realizing they've got wood canoes and these guys have got this huge thing sailing by. Is it only going to matter to you if it's the Spanish and not the English? Or are you going to look at this thing, and especially if you've seen, your sheets blowing and you see the sails and you can kind of deduce that, whoa, if I stick something up and put my canvas on it, the wind can maybe, okay. But the point is, that's kind of the way I look at these things now. At some point, the objects were there. I did a whole lot of work, as exhaustive as I could do it, looking at the people who had written papers prior to Mirabeau releasing his paper on the directed energy air spike. People, the prior work, so to speak, and how many papers had been written afterwards that cited his. So you look at his and see who he cites, and then you go back and look at what that work was in prior to the stuff he had cited. Now, he had written some other papers which showed he's been interested in types of ways to, mitigate shock waves or to be able to travel faster in the atmosphere, this sort of thing. And what that tells me is simply this is a guy who already had some awareness of the science behind or the aerospace engineering aspects of it. And therefore, if he sees something, he's going to be able to recognize far more in it than the average Joe would know who doesn't have the prior experience or the background in aerospace engineering. But the point to me was, if you look at everything he had written, and then you go back and look at everything anyone else had written that he used to cite in his paper, and you realize there was nothing anywhere near the magnitude of that. No one had really anticipated what Ray has in film, and even if some of what people had begun to speculate on how you might do things. I mean, there was counterflow combustion back in, I think, even in the German days and whatnot. But if you look at the technological development stage, I think by 85, I think it was 85 when Ray took his film, how long would it have been, not just on the design stage, but in the experimental stage and the building stage, before you had, I think it was 6 of these things and a 7th, some unusual looking one, 6 of these things that were already produced and able to fly right off the coast of Corpus Christi instead of flying around in Area 51, where if they crashed, it's in a protected area. So you've got these things that are far more than just at the experimental stage, already flying around. And the beam is just one aspect of this thing, because one of these things slows down, waits for the last one to catch up. It doesn't fall out of the sky, so it's certainly not just cruising on the air. It's got some other, propulsion or some other mechanism going on that's keeping it up besides just the beam out front. But if you look at these things, you'll realize also in some of the prior work, and it's something I talked to Ray about, what's notable about it is even some of the earlier indications always had a disc flying like a Frisbee, flat, horizontal mode. Mm-hmm. And I think Mirabeau had even tried to work up some ideas of how could you project a plasma out front of this flat rotating disc so that you would reduce some drag out front, and then you'd have to find a way to close it in the back. And this just on paper, I mean, just an article. And right after he goes to Ray's house, every other design now has a beam coming out of the axis of the center of the disc, and the disc is essentially going to be flying on edge or 90 degrees to the disc, and no more of the other design. So I think it's very obvious to anyone, and that's where I first recognized it, that what he saw in Ray's film changed his whole thinking, his whole aspect of how this, how you might do something like that. No more worrying about how do you spin the plasma out of the edge of the disc. If you're flying that disc on edge and shooting the plasma right out of the center of it, your axis is stable. Off you go. His ideas still require things, and there was an article or a paper written by someone with NASA that was looking at these kind of breakthrough propulsion physics, the new ideas that were coming out. This was 15, 20 years ago, I think, in which he even cited that Mirabeau's ideas really showed promise, but we still lack the technological infrastructure. I mean, a satellite out in space to beam energy from above to this, with the way Mirabeau was trying to do it with our current, ideas or current technology, is one of the things that says, okay, fine. Then who built what Ray filmed? 6 of them, 7 things total, flying right off the coast. Coming along, he runs out of filming them. I mean, his kids saw them first.
Right.
Like I said in the book, his kids were the ones he told them, if you ever see something interesting, I'll give you $10. So the kids are looking and said, "Yeah, look, yeah, right." So the kids pointed out first, and there were other people on the pier down there. And to my understanding, even when Ray tried to contact the paper to ask about it, they had even had a call from some boy who had apparently taken some pictures of it. And they were trying to convince him it was a satellite, broad daylight. But so there were other witnesses to this thing. Ray just happened to be right place at the right time and grab the camera out and take some films of what these things going across. What they were, how would you explain? I mean, how many years does it take you to go through the beta testing and design work and get the funding and all that to get something built? And by 1985, from a practical point of view, if you're Lockheed or whoever and you're building something like this, well, you want to keep getting budget money for next year. So that's like with this stealth aircraft. At some point, you have the whole presentation. You open the hangar with all the mist and all this, and you show these congressmen with their champagne what they paid for. Yeah. Because next year, you got to build something else, and you need more grant money. And 20 or 30 years later, it's old school technology, and you're hopefully working on something newer. But after all this time, we still see nothing out there like what Ray caught on film. And we have no leaks on anything. Nobody's even – the only people that I have ever seen who have come up with ideas that I think look really related to the kind of thing Ray filmed were Mirabeau, who, of course, his designs changed to almost look like what Ray had on film, and a guy named Kevin Kramer out of University of Arizona, I believe, who had, while I was working on the book, he had filed a patent on some method of firing energy, focusing it down a line to where it would actually create a shock wave. And I think I either talked to him on the phone or wrote him some emails and asked him about it. And he was like, "Oh, you're telling me?" Because I said, "I've seen something that looks a lot like that." And he said, "Oh, man, that's nothing. You hate to hear the fact that you have a patent on something somebody's already doing." I was like, well, nobody around here, I don't think. But the point is, there's a little bit of evidence that our scientists, or in some ways in the last 20 years, have begun to come up with, speculate on ideas for doing things like this. But we don't see it in production out here. Nobody's flying around things that look like what Ray got on film. So who built them?
Chris, did you, by the way, I know Ray is listening, so I'm going to invite him to call in. Ray, please call in if you're listening, 603-967-4030. Someone just posted on the chat room, and I know that I saw stills from this film. Have you actually seen the film itself, or did you see the stills?
Not playing. Uh-huh. Like I said earlier, I have asked Ray, digitize 1 minute of it. whatever it takes, go. It was even, you can buy these things not too expensive that allow you to shoot frame by frame, and you can create a digital image of it. I don't know if he's been busy with other things or for whatever reason hasn't got done. He's, as I can imagine, like we talked about Benowitz's films, Ray is extremely protective of the films. In fact, one of the odd things was the last conversation that I had with Mirabeau, where I had just called him anyway, where he was really kind of cautious about talking about it. But he even mentioned, he said, yeah, well, the one thing I remember is Ray was really protective of the films, kept them locked in a safe. And I'm like, you wouldn't know that unless you'd been there. But the idea was, yes, Ray is...
I think that's him. Yeah, he's calling in now. Hey, Ray, how are you? Welcome to the show. Ray, can you hear me? Hey, Ray, can you hear me?
Sure I can.
Hey, how are you, Ray?
Hi. Who am I talking to?
This is Martin, and you're on
Martin.
with
Okay.
both Chris and myself.
Oh, okay. Well, good. Let's have some fun. I think there's a lot of details here in this film and what I've done with it and what I haven't done with it that people might find it interesting for me to share, if I may.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Okay. Well, let me kind of summarize this in some detail. As Chris said, it was my kids that pointed out to me, and unfortunately, I was out $20. But anyway, on the pier with us, back at the base of the pier, there was a man sitting in a folded chair, while his wife and his lovely daughter, who looked about 21 years old, were out on the pier beyond us, and my kids pointed this out to me, and I began to film it. The first thing that happened that was very disconcerting, well, in the first place, we saw initially, they pointed out one object, but as Chris told you, there was a procession of these objects, much to my surprise, that kept coming across the bay. Now, I was brought up in Corpus Christi. I know the direction. They were coming from the direction of Ingleside to the east-northeast across the bay, right overhead, and the first thing that was disconcerting about them from anything I ever expected to see was you think from the literature and that these discs should be flying edge-on. They were not. From the first one, well, I'll go to the last one if we get time later, but the 6 or 7 that were identical. This was really shocking because here you have basically a disc-shaped looking thing that is flying flat side forward. In other words, the dome was on the left side, opposite direction of travel, but on the in other words, imagine this disc up. It's tilted up 90 degrees from the way the cartoons would have us believe a UFO is oriented, and on the left side of it, opposite direction of travel, is the dome, but on the right there's something very strange, and you could see it best when they would turn at an angle enough you could see more of we would think of as the bottom of it, the forward side. And on that side, there was what I thought of as the tower. It looked like it was made out of almost like black girders or something. And then from the base of it, in places, you could see a streak that went out to the rim. Out on the, that was rather pink under there, but around the rim, there were 6 sides to the rim. It actually, when it was firing these things around the rim in slow speed, at slow rotation, it gave me the impression that it was 6-sided, a hexagon, in other words. But when they began to fire rapidly, you would have the appearance that it looked like a circle. Now, because of the slow motion appearance of it, though, I'm inclined to believe that these may have been modular constructions with plug-in pi sections, maybe. But anyway, projecting out from that side is this tower. Well, from time to time, a glow, a brilliant blue-white electrical glow, would appear in this tower, and it would project a beam directly ahead, no matter what direction it was heading, whether first horizontally and then up vertically. This beam projected out. And when you look at the film and study it carefully, I would say the maximum distance this thing projected out in front of it was probably about 30 diameters. And this in itself was contrary to anything I had ever seen. But I had a good camera. it was a Canon 1014 auto zoom, and I was using Super 8 millimeter Electron film in there, and Kodacolor, I guess, whatever it is. Anyway, it was a color transparency film, not a negative film. And I'm filming, as I say, at 10 power. I'm at full telephoto. Well, I put the camera up. I start filming this, and I'm delighted. My gosh, this is so weird. Never seen anything like it. And immediately, almost immediately, after I'd been filming a few seconds, the thing really blew my mind because it suddenly became maybe 2.5 diameters bigger than it should be. It looked like instant. And you're in a position you think, oh my God, this is so important. My camera's broken. I knew there were 32 glass elements in this, or is it 22, in this lens, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's broken. They've automatically magnified it, and I literally started cursing right in front of my kids and the lady and her daughter right there on the pier, and the man at the other end, and I was so upset. And my little daughter, who was 6 years old, she said, Daddy, I don't think your camera broke. It just got bigger. And I turned to the lady there. I said, did it just get bigger? And she said, yes, it just got bigger. Her daughter said the same thing. And I turned to her husband, who was at the end of the pier, and I said, did that thing look like it got bigger? He said, yes, it did. I said, did you see it zoom down toward us as it got bigger? He said, no. He said, it didn't look like coming to you, it got bigger. Well, he was far enough away that I had a feeling that this must be then something optical or something we didn't understand. It was not a matter of just dropping down to us and eventually return to that normal size. Well, when this object and each one of these subsequent objects got almost overhead, a little bit southeast of where we were from 2 overhead there on the Emerald Cove Breakwater Pier, Corpus Christi, on the north side of the E.B. Cole Park, where there were hundreds of people out there. The thing would rotate and point this tower thing upward. It looked like it was vertical or almost vertical from our position, and it would start going straight up. Now, normal aircraft, when you see them, when they go away, they don't disappear going straight up. They go off over the horizon. But this thing did that, and in fact, all of the objects that came along did the same thing. There was one point, though, Chris made a good point there, that one stopped until the other one got just a few diameters from it, and then they went up together. But one of the things that really got this lady and her daughter a little shaken up was this. One of them stopped, and they would always pause in the same place and then go up, as I said, almost vertically. But what happens is that at that point, it stopped, and the beam ahead was not being projected. It wasn't going anywhere. It's only when it's moving that we see this beam ahead. Instead, all of what looked like the rim of it, where there were the blue-white, actually on the film, they look more electrical, kind of a blue-greenish, sequentially firing things that like a theater marquee when they're fired. I mean, the way they're sequentially fired, I think they were sequentially fired. It looked like it was rotating, but I'm not sure because of the orientation of the tower that it was rotating at all, but that was a theater marquee effect. Anyway, the thing is there, and it changes its orientation, and out of the edge, suddenly a totally different kind of so-called beam started happening, but it wasn't a beam of light. And I knew from the literature that this had been described. This was an electric blue-white beam, much bigger in diameter than the beam ahead. It looked totally different. And it projected out slowly as if you're pulling an old-fashioned telescope out. And then it began to rotate around. Now, that's the point where this lovely lady and her daughter just got pretty upset. She turned to me and said, "What is it? What's happening? What's it doing?" And I said, "Don't ask me. I don't know what that is." And but I'm filming it. And anyway, I did film it. And interestingly enough, when you study the film, we were so excited, and this is all happening in high speed. You don't notice every detail. When we got the film to study it, you can see that there are objects coming down this beam, down the center of it. And we've got evidence they're coming through it and then take off at incredible speed across the sky. Years later, when I was talking at a MUFON conference in Germany, the head of the MUFON organization there provided me with some images, one of which was a fabulous case that they rated very highly. Medical doctor and his wife and kids, and his kids alerted his wife, and ultimately his wife alerted him at his doctor's office to see this. There was a disc that projected a beam out, and yes, it launched things through this beam, and I think, if I remember correctly, they eventually came back and joined the beam. Well, we didn't record them coming back to it, But anyway, that eventually the beam rotated around to the left and drew in, and then it resumed its course, turned upward, and went again almost straight up. Now, let me distinguish between that beam, which looks like, well, it can't be a light beam. People call it solid. It wasn't solid. It could have been confined to plasma somehow. But the beam ahead, most people talk about this. They don't mention it, that it's really not like a beam as a laser. When you look at the film, you see that it reminds you of a twisted rope, where you see a spiral pattern in it. And that suggests to me strongly that we have a complex plasma beam of some sort. Well, when I showed this initially to Marable, let's keep in mind, this is before I knew anything about a computer at that time. And what I showed him was just color slides from the film and high contrasted black and white that we only had the ability to do through high contrast printing on an old-fashioned xerographic printer. But he was, forever to his credit that he had open mind enough based upon his student that was getting his PhD with him there, who had seen this down in Texas when I showed it to him when he was at UT before he went from his master's degree to go up there and get his PhD, that he had the courage to come here and look at this with an open mind. Now, if he could see now what I have, now that we've gotten into image processing, you can see it with the naked eye. But as you contrast it, you see, my gosh, this is just not a beam that's creating a plasma in front of it and a shock wave that will protect under low pressure. You actually see that the beam is pulsed, and you can see what we call pulse regimes in the beam interfacing with each other. Each beam has its own magnetic unit. As you have this energy moving across the beam, it's like an electric wire. When you have a current going through it, it's creating a magnetic field. Well, the further out it gets, the weaker it gets. But as they get closer to the source, you see that they're stronger and more intense on what? On refracting the backlighting. You can actually see around these like a Slaren photograph in a wind tunnel, but of course it wasn't a wind tunnel with the Slaren photography. You can actually see the electrification along the different pulse regimes electrifying the air, and it's moving as a kind of a flattened torus back toward the object, which has its, and you at times see the contour due to plasma of its dipolar, two-pole magnetic field, and you actually see this move around it. It's absolutely incredible. And if Maribo's listening to this, I invite him to come down and see what he missed, because it's wonderful. And anyone can follow this from the immediate film images. And I also have copies of them as slides. Let me break in here and say this. Someone was wondering, well, why don't I digitize this film? In the first place, when I got up here, it's been nearly 25 years ago now, I began to discover these tracks of dinosaurs that nobody knew about. And I've become so involved in it. I've done 3 scientific papers, and now a major one is going to be coming out with a news release to a major government agency where I found the tracks. But this is extremely time-consuming. If you're going to publish scientific papers on this, you have to apply yourself to it. But before I did this, down in Corpus, Chris saw this, in the film itself, I would take and mark frames that I needed to make a nice slide of. That's the only access I had to them. You didn't have digital scanners back then. So what I did, I took what's called slide binding tape, which is a tinselized mylar tape with a sticky stuff on it, and I would stick it on the frame that I wanted to copy, and sometimes it would be a series of frames, and I would mark them with a code and have a log of this. Well, now the film has got hundreds of pieces of this tape sticking onto it. It would take a lot of time to get them off, and now we do have wonderful digitizing. It could be run through, and we could have video, and without damaging the film, run it back and forth in digital form. And someday, if I live long enough, I'm 79 years old, I hope to be able to do that. But let me address another question that someone wrote in that you read about. They said, why doesn't Ray show this to us? Okay, I don't want to insult anybody, but please consider this. My primary objective in this is scientific, technological. That's why I invited, when I had the invitation, to Maribot to come see this. My objective from the time I was 15 was to help humanity get into space, hoping that as they get out there, there would almost be a kind of epiphany, and looking down at the world, realize that our differences are not as important as our unity and as a living planet. And this I saw as an opportunity to do this. I realized when I analyzed it that this was probably a technology that would electrify the air in front of it, move it along a magnetic field growing stronger as it approached the craft around it, and close it back behind as a spoiler effect. But my interest is in this as an application technologically. Is there evidence of that? Of course. I managed to raise through a research corporation over $2 million in facilities and equipment to do hard data monitoring, and it was used very successfully. That has been my objective. My objective is not a religious one. I have no drive to convince the public that these things are real. I don't know where they come from. Even as Chris doesn't know where they come from. All I can say is it's a technology that, in my opinion, is beyond anything I know about that could have come from a terrestrial source. I should say, to put this in context, that my gut impression, based on what happened there on the pier that day, was that these objects were each about 20 feet in diameter, and they were probably at about 5,000 feet altitude. And by the way, they were moving completely contrary to the wind, came across, and then would come straight up. Now, the surprise, the last object. This object really blew my mind. I mean, seeing discs flying the way you never thought they were supposed to fly was enough. But the last object looked totally different. Take an old-fashioned hourglass, remove the wooden or plastic frame if it's a modern one, take the hourglass, you see it's two teardrop-shaped things, point to point, put them in the sky, and make them rotate. I'm going to make an auditory sound that is equivalent of the rotation. Is that is about how long it took the two units to rotate 360 degrees. It's pretty fast. But this thing is coming across the sky, and it has plasma colors moving, pretty mother-of-pearl colors, moving around the surface of each half of this so-called hourglass center. And the crazy thing, this sounds really crazy of me to say this, but my gut, and there's purely nothing scientific, but my crazy gut feeling was that this was the same thing I'd been seeing in all the others, but that we were looking at some optical effect that was distorting it. Now, that may be totally wrong because that's subjective, but that's the way it is. But I am quite willing to show this to responsible scientists who want to come here and see this.
Hey,
but
Ray.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, Ray, there's someone that just called in that wants to ask you a question, and that caller, please identify yourself, but before you do, mute your computer, please.
It's muted.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, Ray, to interrupt
I didn't
you.
really,
You had
I didn't really want to respond to Ray. I just had a comment.
Okay, we only have a few minutes
This
left to
sounds
the
like-
show, so go ahead with it if you would.
Well, this sounds like the ramblings of a paranoid schizophrenic. That's all my opinion. That's all I have to say.
Well,
Well,
thank you for
I
your call.
suggest you ask somebody who's seen it if this is the ramblings of a paranoid schizophrenic. My film wasn't paranoid schizophrenic, and it filmed it.
Well, I haven't seen the film, but it's just too many details. I don't want to put you down. That's not my point.
Well, that's what you're doing in calling me a paranoid schizophrenic now, isn't it?
Well,
let's be frank about it. You know it is. Now, let me mention.
No, I don't.
mean, there are high-level scientists who've seen this, and they're with me on this completely. One major physicist came here, watched for 10 hours, 10 and a half hours, in fact, and said, Ray, I really appreciate this, wrote me a $1,000 check and said, a workman's worth this hour. Thanks for taking the time to show it to me. So I think that speaks something about the value that he assigned to it. Okay? So thanks for your comment.
Okay, Ray. Well, I'm not going to, comment any further. That was just my impression.
Okay. You're
All
welcome
right.
to it.
Thank you for your call.
All right, thanks. All right, bye.
All right, Ray, we only have 6 minutes left or so.
I see that.
Thereabouts. So, Ray, that, it comes up a lot of times. The number one thing that comes up when we talk about it is why aren't these things out to the public? I know you're addressing that this has to do more of a scientific thing, but is there any further thing you can add to, I know you're cautious. You're very cautious, and I could tell that when I was actually visiting you, how cautious you were even showing me things. But is there anything else you want to add to the reason why you're not getting these digitized and out there?
My objective is not that, and I don't have time to do that now. I'm hoping to, when I get clear of this big thing, it's going to come out in
yes, I know you don't have time now. Yes.
When I get through with that, yes. But my hope is that all of you will get to see this. We'll get to see this in time in its full glory, both as the original film and then as image processing that shows false color contouring of what's happening around the beam. That would be my hope. It would be nice. But first go with the technological. But then, yes, I'd love for people to see it.
Yes, great. Well, I do appreciate that. And I have been talking to you along as you're working on this dinosaur paper, which is totally amazing. And your name is going to be almost a household name to speak of, more or less, coming up pretty soon here. There's going to be a lot of publicity.
That's right. Probably within the next 2 to 3 months, hopefully quicker. And in a major magazine, they'll also be seeing a picture of me holding a big footprint of what most people know as a pterodactyl. It's actually called a pterosaur, but I can't say anything more about that. But anyway, yeah, I'm deeply involved in this, but I promise these people I will get back to them. I've satisfied the technological with Mirabeau, and now I hope that I can please your curiosity in letting you see it.
Yeah.
Live.
Okay, Ray. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks.
All right, take care now.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, you bet. All right, take care. All right. So, Chris, we only have a couple of minutes left here. Is your website XDesk Publishing? Is that your website?
Yeah, it's still there. I haven't touched it in a while. I need to get back to it. Actually, I was thinking about that today. I have a lot more things that I want to put on it, and actually, maybe with some of the work I've been doing, hopefully get some documentary stuff on there too. Kind of expand it a little bit. I haven't actually touched it in a while, and of course, moving recently has kept me occupied for a long time. But yeah, that's my website. The book is on there. There's a few things on there to see, primarily some Benowitz kind of stuff as well. But I'm hoping to get back and update that thing pretty soon. Let me make just one quick closing comment.
Sure.
A caller who comes in and makes a comment like that is of no value. In ufology, it didn't address the subject anyway. And all I would have to say about Ray and his films is I have been in it long enough that even though Ray and I have had our differences at times, I still stand behind, what he's got on film. I've seen the film he's got. Even more so, as I said, it's not just what I'm saying. I just point at Mirabeau. This is a guy who's an aerospace engineer, got skills way beyond what I've got. He's seen those. He's recognized what's in the films as well. It proves that the films are there. It proves that the films are valid. I've talked to his daughter, who was one of the first ones to point them out to him. I'm a cautious sort of guy and don't typically trust anything at face value, especially when it comes to UFOs per se. But I agree with I understand everybody's frustration over Ray not having seen them. As I said before the show, I talked to you. I said, yeah, it's a 20-year argument Ray and I have had. But personalities aside, the films I stand by. What Ray has, I stand by. Ray is a unique character of his own right, but I think it's totally unfair and uncalled for to just come online and make a comment like that about anyone. So I would just say, everybody, wait to see the evidence.
Yeah.
The messenger is one thing. The evidence is something totally separate.
Well, that's a good message to say goodnight on. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Chris.
Thanks,
right.
Martin. Have a great night.
All
Bye-bye.
right. And I'll talk to you soon.
Sure enough. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. Or if you're supporting the show, I want to thank you for doing that as well. Next week, we'll be back with Caroline Corey. And it should be an interesting show. And so, again, I want to thank you for either supporting the show or watching live and joining in the chat room. And talk to you next week.